Ambassador Kim Dae woke up at 6 in the morning just like he had done every day for the past 10 years. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, and put on his blue Earth diplomatic uniform. The uniform had small golden stars on the collar that showed he was a senior ambassador. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a tired man who had spent too many years trying to make aliens understand that humans were not the bad guys. The space station where the Galactic Council met was huge. It was bigger than most cities on Earth, and it floated in space between 3 different solar systems. The station had crystal towers that reached up into the darkness of space and moving walkways that carried thousands of alien beings from one meeting room to another. Kim Dae had walked these same corridors for 10 years, and he knew every corner, every shop, and every alien face that worked there. Kim Dae ate breakfast in the human section of the station. There were only 12 humans living on the station permanently, and they all worked for Earth government. Most of them were translators or trade specialists. Kim Dae was the only full ambassador. The other humans at breakfast looked tired too. They had all heard the rumors that today would be another bad day for humanity and the council. The human section was small and quiet. It had Earth food and Earth music and pictures of green forests and blue oceans. Kim Dae missed Earth every day, but his job was important. He was the voice of humanity. In a galaxy full of species who thought humans were dangerous or stupid or both, he finished his coffee and walked to the council chambers. The Galactic Council chamber was the most impressive room Kim Dae had ever seen. It was shaped like a giant circle with seats rising up in layers like an ancient Roman arena. The ceiling was made of clear crystal so you could see the stars outside. Each species had their own section with special equipment for their needs. The Vorthak had heating platforms because they were cold-blooded. The Zilani had sound amplifiers because they spoke through musical tones. The Thorians had gravity reducers because they came from a heavy world. Kim Dae sat in the human section, which was much smaller than most others. Humanity only had one vote in the council, even though humans lived on more worlds than any other species except the Vorthak Empire. The human section had simple chairs and a basic translation system. Kim Dae often thought it looked poor compared to the fancy equipment the other species had. The session started with routine business trade agreements between different worlds, new colony applications, safety regulations for space travel. Kim Dae listened through his translator and took notes. Like he always did, most of the business did not involve humans directly, but Kim Dae had learned that everything in the galaxy somehow connected to everything else. Then Council Prime Director Thexmar called for the weekly report on galactic security. This was always the part of the meeting that Kim Dae dreaded because somehow humans always got blamed for something. Thexmar was a creature that looked like a giant insect with multiple eyes and 4 arms. He had been the Prime Director for 15 years, and he had never liked humans. The first speaker was Delegate Vexler from the Vorthak Empire. Vexler was 7 feet tall and covered in dark green scales that reflected the light in the chamber. His yellow eyes were cold and calculating. As he looked directly at Kim Dae while he spoke, Vexler said humans were expanding too fast into new systems. He claimed that human colonies were taking the best planets and leaving nothing for other species. He said human terraforming technology was destroying natural ecosystems and that human settlers were not respecting the sacred sites of ancient civilizations. Kim Dae wanted to stand up and argue humans only colonized empty worlds. They had strict rules against taking any planet that had intelligent life or important historical sites. Human terraforming actually improved dead planets and made them suitable for many different species. But Kim Dae had learned that interrupting during formal accusations only made things worse. The next speaker was Delegate Zilana from the Zilani Republic. The Zilani looked like living crystals, and they communicated through beautiful musical sounds that the translators converted into words. Zilana's voice was like a sad song as she complained about human behavior. Zelena said humans were too violent and aggressive. She claimed that human peacekeepers used too much force when they stopped conflicts between other species. She said human diplomats were rude and did not understand proper civilized behavior. She suggested that humans needed special training to learn how to act properly in galactic society. Kim Dae felt his hands clench into fists under the table. Human peacekeepers had died protecting Zilani colonies from raiders. Human diplomats had worked day and night to prevent wars that would have killed millions. The accusation of being uncivilized was especially painful because humans spent years learning about other cultures before they were allowed to work in space more. Speakers followed, each one had complaints about humans. The Thorian said human traders were too competitive and were hurting traditional Thorian businesses. The Kethver claimed that human scientists were asking too many questions about things that should remain mysterious. The Plexoni accused humans of being too curious about other species' technology. Kim Dae had heard all these complaints before. What made him angry was that none of the speakers mentioned the good things humans did. They did not talk about the human doctors who had cured the Zelani crystal plague. They did not mention the human engineers who had fixed the Thorian orbital cities when they were falling apart. They ignored the human peacekeepers who had stopped the Kethver Civil War from destroying 3 star systems. As each speaker finished, the other delegates would make approving sounds or gestures. Kim Dae could see nods and agreement throughout the chamber. It seemed like everyone was happy to blame humans for the GalaXY problems. Then Prime Director Thexmar stood up to give his own statement. His multiple eyes focused on Kim Dae, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber. Sound system. Thexmar said that humans were clearly not ready for full participation in galactic civilization. He suggested that humanity was still too primitive and aggressive to be trusted with important decisions. He recommended that human voting rights in the council should be reduced until humans could prove they had learned proper behavior from the more advanced species. The chamber erupted in approving sounds. Many delegates stood up to show their agreement with the Prime Director proposal. Kim Dae could see species that usually disagreed with each other nodding together when it came to criticizing humans. Thexmar continued his speech. He said that humans needed guidance from civilized species. He suggested that human colonies should have supervisors from other species to make sure humans did not make mistakes. He even proposed that human children should be educated by alien teachers so they could learn proper galactic values. Kim Dae felt something break inside his chest. This was not just criticism anymore. This was a proposal to treat humanity like children who could not take care of themselves. He thought about all the human families living peacefully on colony worlds. He thought about human children who were already learning to respect other species' cultures. He thought about human soldiers who had died defending alien worlds. The worst part was that Thexmar was smiling as he spoke. His multiple eyes showed satisfaction as if he was enjoying the humiliation of humanity. Kim Dae realized that this was not about making things better. This was about putting humans in their place and making sure they never became too powerful or important in galactic politics. Kim Dae looked around the chamber and saw that almost every delegate was nodding in agreement. A few species looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up to defend humanity. The human section felt very small and very alone in the huge chamber. For 10 years, Kim Dae had believed that patience and hard work would eventually earn respect for humanity. He had thought that by following all the rules and being polite and helpful, humans would prove their worth to the galaxy. But looking at the satisfied faces around him, Kim Dae realized that some species would never accept humans as equals. The final insult came when Thexmar suggested that humans should be grateful for this guidance. He said that the advanced species of the galaxy were offering to help primitive humanity learn proper civilization. He made it sound like the other species were doing humans a favor by treating them like inferior beings. Kim Dae stood up slowly. The chamber noise died down as delegates noticed the human ambassador movement. Everyone watched as Kim Dae reached for his universal translator device, the small piece of technology that had allowed him to communicate with hundreds of different species for 10 years without saying a word. Kim Dae removed the translator from his ear and placed it carefully on the table in front of him. The small device sat there like a symbol of broken communication and failed friendship, then in perfect galactic standard language that he had spent years learning. Kim Dae spoke his final words as Earth ambassador to the galaxy. Kim Dae said that humanity was withdrawing from all diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council. He said that humans would no longer participate in galactic politics or provide services to alien species. He told the chamber that Earth was recalling all human diplomats, traders, peacekeepers, and workers from across the galaxy. His voice was calm and clear as he delivered the message that would change everything. He wished them good luck and turned to walk out of the chamber. The message arrived at exactly midnight Earth Standard Time on every human device across the galaxy. It was short and simple, but its meaning was clear. Prime Minister Libio Rem had made the decision that would change everything for humanity. The message said, "Come home immediately. All diplomatic and commercial operations are terminated effective. Now return to Earth as soon as possible." On the trading station, Nexus Prime Administrator Cho Soo-jin was working late in her office when her personal communicator buzzed with the urgent message. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. Then she looked around her office at the 10 years of work she had put into making Nexus Prime the most successful trading hub in the outer rim. Cho Soo-jin had built the financial systems that allowed dozens of different species to trade with each other safely. She had created currency exchange programs that prevented cheating and established shipping routes that connected hundreds of worlds. Her work had made thousands of alien merchants rich and had brought prosperity to entire star systems, but the message was clear: she was coming home. Cho Soo-jin began the process of shutting down human operations on Nexus Prime. She called her assistant manager Yun Tae-ho and told him to prepare all human staff for immediate departure. Yun Tae-ho was shocked and asked what had happened. Cho Soo-jin explained that Earth had withdrawn from all galactic activities and that they had 48 hours to pack everything and leave. The news spread quickly through the human section of Nexus Prime. There were 300 humans working on the station, most of them in trade management, logistics, and financial services. They had families and friends among the alien population. Many had lived on Nexus Prime for years and considered it their home, but orders were orders. Cho Soo-jin spent the next day transferring control of human systems to alien administrators. The Zalani deputy manager Rolantha seemed confused about the complex financial networks Cho Soo-jin had built. Rolantha kept asking questions about currency, stabilization protocols, and trade dispute resolution procedures. Cho Soo-jin tried to explain how the systems worked, but realized that most aliens had never bothered to learn the details. They had simply trusted humans to handle the complicated parts of interstellar commerce. Now they would have to figure it out themselves. The hardest part was saying goodbye to her alien friends. Merchant Captain Voshtik from the Thorian worlds had worked with Cho Soo-jin for 8 years. He begged her to stay and asked what his shipping business would do without human logistics support. Cho Soo-jin felt sad, but she could not disobey direct orders from Earth. On the border world of Kepler-7, veteran peacekeeper Park Min-ho received the same message while he was mediating talks between Krell and Zephyrian representatives. The two species had been arguing about mining rights in the disputed Tau sector for 6 months. Park Min-ho had been slowly building trust between the negotiating teams. Park Min-ho was 62 years old and had spent his entire adult life preventing wars between alien species. He spoke 7 different alien languages fluently and understood the cultural customs of dozens of civilizations. He had successfully mediated over 300 disputes during his career. When his communicator buzzed with the recall message, Park Min-ho was in the middle of explaining Krell honor concepts to the Zephyrian delegation. He had finally made a breakthrough, and both sides seemed ready to compromise on the mining agreement. But the message was absolute. Park Min-ho stood up and announced to both delegations that he was being recalled to Earth immediately. The Krell representative War Master Gexton demanded to know why Park Min-ho was leaving in the middle of negotiations. The Zephyrian ambassador seemed equally confused. Park Min-ho explained that humanity had withdrawn from all diplomatic activities. He said that the negotiations would have to continue without human mediation. He wished both sides good luck and began packing his equipment. War Master Gexton grabbed Park Min-ho arm and said that the Krell Empire needed human mediation to prevent war with the Zephyrians. Park Min-ho gently removed the alien hand and said that both species were intelligent and civilized and should be able to solve their problems without human help. The Zephyrian ambassador protested that 50 years of peace in the region depended on human peacekeeping. Park Min-ho nodded sadly and said that 50 years should have been enough time for both species to learn how to keep peace themselves. Within hours of Park Min-ho departure, both the Krell and Zephyrian delegations accused each other of bad faith negotiations. The mining dispute quickly escalated into threats of military action across the galaxy. Similar scenes were happening everywhere. Human diplomats packed their belongings and prepared to leave posts they had held for decades. Human traders closed down businesses that had taken years to build. Human peacekeepers abandoned conflict zones where their presence had maintained fragile ceasefires. On the industrial world of Titan Beta, Chief Engineer GalaXY supervised the shutdown of the antimatter processing facility he had designed. The facility provided clean energy to 17 different star systems and employed 2,000 alien workers. GalaXY had spent 12 years perfecting the safety systems that made antimatter production safe and efficient. Alien engineers who worked under GalaXY pleaded with him to stay. They said the facility could not operate without human expertise. GalaXY showed them all the technical manuals and safety procedures, but the aliens seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of antimatter engineering. GalaXY felt terrible about leaving, but he had received his orders. The facility would have to shut down until the aliens could learn to operate it safely. This meant that 17 star systems would lose their primary energy source. In the medical research station orbiting Proxima Centauri, Dr. Kim Yeon-soo was working on a cure for the Zilani crystal rot disease that had been spreading through Zilani colonies. The disease was fatal to Zilani, and no other species understood Zilani biology well enough to develop treatments. Dr. Kim had been working with Zilani medical researchers for 5 years and was close to a breakthrough. The Zilani scientists begged her to stay and finish the research. Dr. Kim wanted to help, but her orders were clear. She gave all her research data to the Zilani team and hoped they could continue the work without her. On the mining colony of New Seoul in the Vega system, colonial administrator Oh Young-min organized the evacuation of 8,000 human civilians. The colony had been built to extract rare minerals needed for advanced technology, but it also served as a refugee center for aliens fleeing various conflicts. The alien refugees panicked when they learned that humans were leaving. Many of them had nowhere else to go. Oh Young-min tried to arrange for other species to take over refugee services, but most aliens said they did not have the resources or experience to handle large refugee populations. Oh Young-min felt like he was abandoning people who needed help, but he could not leave human civilians on the colony without proper support. Everyone had to go home to Earth. The evacuation ships began arriving within days. Huge transport vessels designed to carry thousands of passengers appeared in star systems across the galaxy. Human families packed their belongings and said goodbye to alien neighbors, many of whom had become close friends over the years. Children who had grown up on alien worlds and learned alien languages cried as they left the only homes they had ever known. Human teenagers who had alien classmates and friends protested that they did not want to go to Earth where they had never lived, but the evacuation was mandatory. Every human in the galaxy had to return home. The alien species watched the human exodus with mixed feelings. Some were glad to see humans leave and celebrated their departure as liberation from human interference. Others were worried about what would happen without human help in trade diplomacy, peacekeeping, and technical services on Nexus Prime. The financial systems began showing errors within hours of Cho Sujin departure. Currency exchange rates fluctuated wildly as alien administrators struggled to understand the complex algorithms that maintained stability. Trading disputes that humans had always resolved quickly piled up in the arbitration system. The Zilani deputy manager Rolantha sent desperate messages to other Zilani officials asking for help with the trading station operations. But most of Zilani had always assumed that trade management was too boring and complicated for their artistic society to worry about. They had left all the details to humans on Kepler 7. The Krell and Zephyrian delegations tried to continue their mining negotiations without Park Min-ho mediation. Within 6 hours, both sides had walked out of the talks, claiming the other side was being unreasonable. Without Park Min-ho cultural expertise, neither side understood why the other was offended. On Titan Beta, the antimatter facility automatically shut down its reactors when the alien engineers failed to perform required safety checks. The aliens had the technical manuals, but they did not understand the underlying principles well enough to operate the systems safely. 17 star systems lost power and industrial production ground to a halt. Billions of aliens found themselves without electricity, transportation, or communication systems that depended on antimatter energy in the Proxima Centauri medical station. The Zelani research team tried to continue Dr. Kim work on the crystal rot cure, but they made a mistake in the genetic sequencing that contaminated months of research. War Master Gexton of the Krell Empire stood in his command ship looking at the tactical display that showed Zephyrian Commonwealth fleets moving toward the disputed Tau sector. The red dots on the screen represented enemy ships, and there were more of them than he had expected. The mining rights dispute that had seemed so simple just days ago was now threatening to become a full-scale war. 3 days had passed since human mediator Park Min-ho had left Kepler-7, and the peace talks had collapsed completely. The Krell delegation had tried to negotiate directly with the Zephyrians, but everything went wrong. The Zephyrians kept making what the Krell considered insulting offers, while the Krell responses seemed to enrage the Zephyrian. Negotiator Shexton did not understand why the talks were failing so badly. When Park Min-ho was present, both sides had been making progress toward an agreement. The human mediator had seemed to understand exactly what each side needed and had found ways to give both species what they wanted without either side losing face. Now, without the human translator, everything the Krell said seemed to make the Zephyrians angry. The Zephyrians kept talking about collective decision-making and consensus building, which sounded like weakness to Krell ears. The Krell emphasis on individual honor and direct leadership seemed to insult the Zephyrian sense of democratic cooperation. What Gexton did not know was that Park Min-ho had spent 50 years learning the subtle differences between Krell and Zephyrian cultures. The human mediator understood that when Krells spoke about honor, they were actually talking about responsibility and trustworthiness. When Zephyrians discussed consensus, they meant respect for every individual voice in their society. Park Min-ho had learned to translate not just words but cultural concepts. He could take a Krell statement about warrior pride and explain it to Zephyrians as a commitment to protecting civilians. He could take Zephyrian concerns about democratic process and present them to Krells as a way to ensure that all fighters were heard before battle. Without this cultural translation, the two species were essentially speaking different languages. Even when they used the same words, the crisis escalated when Zephyrian Admiral Telazar interpreted a routine Krell fleet movement as a military threat. The Krell had moved ships to protect their mining operations in the outer Tau sector, but the Zephyrians saw this as aggressive positioning for an attack on Commonwealth territory. Admiral Telazar had always disliked human involvement in Commonwealth affairs. She had argued for years that the Zephyrians were sophisticated enough to handle their own diplomacy without primitive human interference. Now she saw the Krell fleet movement as proof that humans had been secretly helping the Krell plan military operations. Telazar ordered Commonwealth fleets to counterposition near Krell forces. The Zephyrian ships were faster and more maneuverable than Krell vessels, but the Krell had heavier weapons and stronger shields. Both fleets began running combat exercises that looked very much like preparation for battle on the neutral trading station. Orbital 7 merchant captain Voshtik watched the news reports with growing alarm. His shipping business depended on safe passage through the Tau sector. If the Krell and Zephyrians went to war, the entire region would become too dangerous for civilian traffic. Vostek tried to contact both military commanders to offer his services as a neutral mediator, but neither side trusted Thorian merchants to understand their military concerns. The Thorians were traders, not warriors, and both the Krell and Zephyrians believed that only warriors could understand matters of honor and territory. What they did not realize was that human mediators like Park Min-ho had never been warriors either. Humans succeeded at mediation because they listened carefully to what each side really wanted and found creative ways to satisfy those needs. Park Min-ho had prevented the Tau sector war not through military expertise but through patient understanding of cultural differences. The situation became critical when a Krell patrol ship and a Zephyrian scout vessel had a collision while both were investigating mining activity in disputed space. Both sides claimed the other ship had deliberately rammed them and demanded immediate compensation. Under human mediation, such incidents had been resolved quickly through accident investigation and insurance claims. But without neutral human investigators, both sides conducted their own inquiries and reached opposite conclusions. The Krell determined that the Zephyrian ship had attacked them, while the Zephyrians concluded that the Krell had committed an act of war. News of the collision spread quickly through both empires. Krell citizens demanded military action to defend their honor, while Zephyrian communities called for protection against Krell aggression. The political pressure on both governments made compromise increasingly difficult. On the Galactic Council Station, Prime Director Vexmar called an emergency session to address the growing crisis. Many delegates were confused about why the situation was deteriorating so rapidly. The Krell and Zephyrians had maintained peace for 50 years, so why were they suddenly ready to fight over mining rights? Delegate Vexter from the Vorthek Empire suggested that the crisis proved humans had been manipulating both sides for their own benefit. He claimed that human withdrawal had revealed the true aggressive nature of both the Krell and Zephyrians, who were now free to pursue their natural warlike instinct. The Zilani representative Zilana disagreed and said that the crisis showed how dependent the galaxy had become on human services. She suggested that other species needed to develop their own mediation capabilities to replace human expertise, but developing mediation skills would take years of training and cultural study. The immediate crisis needed attention now. Before anyone could volunteer to attempt mediation, the situation exploded into open warfare. The spark came when Krell forces detected Zephyrian ships conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance flights over Krell mining installations. Warmaster Gexton interpreted this as preparation for an attack on Krell civilians and ordered his ships to intercept the Zephyrian scouts. Admiral Telazar saw the Krell interception as an unprovoked attack on Commonwealth vessels conducting legitimate patrol operations. She ordered her fleet to defend the scouts, and the first Battle of the New Tau Sector War began. The fighting was brutal and destructive. Both sides had advanced weapons that had not been used in combat for decades. The Krell favored massive energy cannons that could destroy enemy ships with single hits, while the Zephyrians used swarm tactics with fast attack craft that overwhelmed enemy defenses within hours. Both fleets had suffered heavy casualties, and the space around the disputed mining stations was filled with debris from destroyed ships. Rescue operations became impossible as both sides fired on any vessel that approached the battle zone. News of the battle reached other star systems quickly, and panic began to spread. Civilian ships fled the Tau sector as fast as their engines could carry them. Trade routes that had been safe for 50 years became war zones overnight. On the trading world of commerce, Prime Merchant Guild leader Haxvan watched his economic empire crumble as shipping through the Tau sector stopped completely. His warehouses were full of goods that could not be delivered, and his transport ships were stranded in port, afraid to venture into the war. Zone Haxiven sent desperate messages to both Krell and Zephyrian governments asking them to allow neutral merchant vessels to pass through the conflict area, but both sides refused. All ships in the Tau sector were now considered potential military targets. The war expanded rapidly as both empires called up reserve fleets and began mobilizing their full military strength. What had started as a minor dispute over mining rights was becoming the largest military conflict the galaxy had seen in a century. Smaller species, caught between the two powers, found themselves forced to choose sides. The Thorian merchant worlds reluctantly allied with the Zephyrians because they needed Commonwealth protection for their trade routes. The Kethver mining colonies joined the Krell Empire because they shared similar warrior cultures. Refugee ships began fleeing the war zone, carrying millions of civilians who no longer felt safe in their home. Space stations and planets near the conflict area were overwhelmed with people seeking shelter and safety. On the Galactic Council Station, emergency meetings continued around the clock as delegates tried to find someone willing and able to mediate between the warring powers. But every species that was suggested had cultural or economic ties to one side or the other that made them unsuitable as neutral mediators. The Vorthek had trade agreements with the Krell that made them suspect to the Zephyrians. The Zilani had cultural exchange programs with the Commonwealth that made them unacceptable to the Krell. The Thorians were already allied with the Zephyrians, and the Kethver supported the Krell Prime Director Vexmar realized with growing horror that humans had been the only truly neutral mediators in the galaxy. Every other species had relationships and interests that compromised their ability to serve as fair arbitrators in disputes. As the war entered its second week and casualty reports mounted into the hundreds of thousands, Dexmar finally understood what the galaxy had lost when Kim Day walked out of the council chamber. The humans had not just been providing a service, they had been preventing exactly this kind of catastrophic conflict, but it was too late. The war was spreading and no one knew how to stop it. The galaxy was learning The first sign of economic disaster came from the currency exchange markets on Nexus Prime 3 days after Cho Soo-jin departure. The automated trading systems began showing error messages that no one understood. The Zilani deputy manager Relantha stared at screens full of numbers that were changing too fast to follow. The human-designed financial networks had maintained stability across hundreds of different planetary economies. Each world had its own currency based on local resources and cultural values. The Krell used honor credits based on military service. The Zephyrians traded in consensus tokens that represented community approval. The Vorthak dealt in thermal units related to their energy production. Cho Soo-jin had spent years creating exchange rate formulas that allowed all these different systems to work together. She had built automatic stabilizers that prevented any single currency from collapsing and taking others down with it. The system was so complex that it required constant monitoring and adjustment, but Relantha did not understand the underlying mathematics. She tried to follow the instruction manuals that Cho Soo-jin had left behind, but the procedures assumed knowledge of economic theory that most aliens had never bothered to learn. They had always left the boring details of finance to humans. When the Krell honor credit suddenly jumped in value by 300%, Relantha panicked and tried to correct it manually. She changed several settings in the stabilization system without understanding what they controlled. The result was catastrophic. The Zephyrian consensus token crashed to 1/10 of its previous value within hours. This triggered automatic sell orders that dumped billions of tokens onto the market, driving the price even lower. The Zephyrian Commonwealth found that their currency was suddenly worthless in galactic trade. On the Zephyrian capital world, New Harmony, millions of citizens discovered that their life savings could not buy basic necessities from off-world suppliers. Imported food became too expensive for most families to afford. Medical supplies from other star systems were priced beyond the reach of hospitals. Commonwealth Finance Minister Yolandra sent urgent messages to trading partners asking them to accept Zephyrian goods in direct barter instead of currency, but most alien merchants had become accustomed to the convenience of universal credit transfers. They did not want to return to the complicated negotiations required for barter trade. Meanwhile, the overvalued Krell honor credit created different problems for the Empire. Suddenly, Krell goods were so expensive that no other species could afford to buy them. Krell weapons manufacturers found their export orders cancelled as foreign buyers sought cheaper alternatives. Warmters Gexton received reports that the Empire civilian economy was suffering because they could not sell their products to other worlds. The Krell had specialized in military technology and heavy manufacturing that required imported raw materials. Now they could not afford to buy materials from other species because their currency was too strong. The economic chaos spread rapidly through the galactic trade networks on the mining world of Asteroid Prime. Excavation Chief Rakhtar watched his operation shut down because he could not afford to buy replacement equipment from off-world suppliers. The mining equipment had been manufactured on different worlds using specialized alloys and components that required precise specifications. Rakhtar had always ordered parts through human trade networks that handled all the technical details and ensured compatibility. Now, when Rakhtar tried to order replacement drill bits from the Thorian industrial world manufacture beta, the transaction failed because the currency converter could not determine a fair exchange rate. The Thorian manufacturers wanted payment in stable thermal units, but Asteroid Prime only earned unstable mineral tokens. Similar problems occurred throughout the galaxy as trade relationships that had functioned smoothly for decades suddenly became impossible to manage. Cargo ships sat in port unable to purchase fuel because currency exchanges were not working. Transport companies could not pay their alien crews because payroll systems had crashed on the luxury resort World Paradise Station tourism manager. Flaxman watched his business collapse. As visitors from different species could not afford to pay for services, the resort had always catered to wealthy aliens from multiple worlds, but now the currency chaos made it impossible to set prices that made sense. A Zilani art collector who had planned to spend a fortune on rare sculptures found that his consensus tokens were worthless. A Krell general who wanted to vacation with his family discovered that his honor credits were so valuable that a simple meal cost more than most aliens earned in a year. The transportation industry was hit particularly hard. Interstellar shipping had depended on human logistics networks that coordinated cargo movements across hundreds of worlds. Human companies like the one Cho Soo-jin had managed handled everything from loading schedules to insurance claims. Without human coordination, shipping became chaotic. Cargo ships arrived at destinations to find that no one knew what they were carrying or who was supposed to receive the goods. Loading docks on major trade worlds became clogged with containers that sat unclaimed because the paperwork was lost or incomprehensible. Captain Vostok tried to deliver a cargo of thorium-manufactured goods to a Zilani colony but discovered that the shipping manifest was written in human standard format that the Zilani customs officials could not read. The goods sat in the ship hold for weeks while officials tried to figure out what they were and whether they were legal to import. The insurance industry collapsed completely. Human companies had provided coverage for most interstellar trade, protecting merchants against pirates, accidents, and natural disasters, but the alien insurance companies that tried to take over human business found that they did not understand the risk calculations. A Vorthak insurance company agreed to cover a shipment of rare crystals from the Zilani worlds to Krell space, but they had no idea that the shipping route passed through an asteroid field that required special navigation equipment. The ship was destroyed by asteroid impact, and the insurance company went bankrupt trying to pay the claim. Piracy returned to space lanes that had been safe for decades. Human patrol fleets had coordinated with local security forces to maintain safe shipping corridors, but without human organization, the anti-piracy efforts became fragmented and ineffective. Pirate Captain Slickster had been out of business for 15 years because human security made raiding too dangerous. Now he returned to his old hunting grounds in the Outer Rim and found merchant ships traveling alone without protection. The first cargo vessel he attacked surrendered immediately because they had no weapons or trained crew. Word spread quickly through the pirate networks that the space lanes were undefended again. Criminal organizations that had been suppressed by human law enforcement began operating openly. Merchant vessels either stopped traveling dangerous routes or hired expensive private security that made shipping costs prohibitive. The manufacturing sector suffered as supply chains broke down. Factories that had depended on components from multiple worlds found themselves unable to obtain necessary materials. A spacecraft assembly plant on Industrial 7 could not get engine parts from Krell Foundry's computer systems from Zilani workshops and life support equipment from Thorian manufacturers. The Zilani Computer Workshop had always sold its products through human trading networks that understood the technical specifications required for spacecraft systems. Now the workshop received orders for components, but the specifications were written in alien technical languages they could not read. A simple order for navigation computers became a disaster when the Zilani workshop delivered units designed for atmospheric flight to a company that needed deep space navigation systems. The spacecraft equipped with wrong computers became lost in hyperspace and were never found. Agricultural worlds that had specialized in feeding other planets found their export markets collapsing. The farming planet Green Valley had converted most of its land to growing crops that other species could eat safely, but without human food distribution networks, they could not get their products to hungry populations. Billions of aliens who had become accustomed to imported food faced shortages and rationing. Urban worlds that had never developed their own agriculture began experiencing famine as food shipments stopped arriving on the city world metro prime. Millions of Vorthak citizens lined up at government distribution centers hoping to receive basic nutrition. The world had been completely dependent on food imports for over a century and had no way to feed its population without galactic trade. Medical supply shortages created health crises across the galaxy. Hospitals that had depended on medicines and equipment from other worlds found themselves unable to treat patients. The Zilani crystal rot disease that Dr. Kim Yan-Su had been researching continued spreading as medical facilities ran out of treatment supplies. Research facilities that had been working on cures for various diseases lost access to specialized equipment and materials that were manufactured on different worlds. Scientific progress slowed to a halt as researchers found themselves isolated from the collaborative networks that had made breakthrough discoveries possible. The stock markets on major financial worlds crashed as investors realized that the galactic economy was collapsing. Retirement funds disappeared overnight, leaving millions of aliens with no financial. Prime Director Thexmar stood alone in his private office, looking out at the chaos that had once been the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. 6 months ago, the Galactic Council chamber had been filled with delegates from hundreds of worlds, conducting the business of interstellar civilization. Now half the seats sat empty as member species withdrew to deal with their own crises. The massive view screen on his office wall displayed reports from across the galaxy. Each news bulletin brought worse information. The Krell-Zephyrian War had spread to 17 star systems. Economic collapse had destroyed the savings of billions of citizens. Piracy had returned to space lanes that had been safe for generations. Refugee ships crowded around the few remaining stable worlds, begging for a sanctuary. Thexmar multiple eyes focused on the casualty reports that updated every few minutes. The numbers were staggering. 3 million military personnel killed in the expanding wars, 8 million civilians dead from famine and disease caused by supply chain failures, 12 million refugees displaced from their homes by violence and economic disaster. The Prime Director, who had once mocked human intelligence, now spent his days trying to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. Just 6 months ago, the galaxy had seemed peaceful and prosperous. Trade flowed smoothly between worlds. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation. Wars were rare and usually brief. Now civilization itself was collapsing, and Thexmar was beginning to realize that humans had been the invisible foundation holding everything together. The first indication of how serious the situation had become was the emergency council session, where only 60% of the delegates showed up. Many species had recalled their representatives to deal with local emergencies. Others had simply stopped participating in galactic government because they no longer believed it was effective. Delegate Vexther from the Vorthak Empire delivered a scathing report on the breakdown of interstellar trade. His people were facing food shortages because their specialized industrial economy could not feed itself without imports. The proud Vorthak, who had complained about human commercial dominance, were now begging other species to accept their manufactured goods in exchange for basic necessity. The Zilani representative Zilantha musical voice carried notes of desperation as she described the spread of crystal rot disease through her people colonies. Without human medical expertise, the plague was killing thousands of Zilani every day. Their own doctors could not develop effective treatments fast enough to save lives. Even the usually confident Thorian merchant delegate Haxvan admitted that his people trading networks had collapsed. Without human logistics support, cargo ships wandered aimlessly through space, unable to find buyers for their goods, while planets desperate for supplies could not locate available shipments. As each delegate spoke, Thexmar realized that every species had become dependent on human services in ways they had never acknowledged. The galaxy had treated humans as junior partners while relying on them for essential functions that kept civilization operating. The breaking point came when Admiral Telazar of the Zephyrian Commonwealth contacted the Council directly, requesting immediate mediation to end the war with the Krell Empire. Her proud fleet was being destroyed in battles that neither side knew how to stop. The Commonwealth had lost half its military strength and civilian casualties were mounting daily. War Master Gexton made a similar plea from the Krell Empire. His forces were winning battles but losing the war as their economy collapsed under the strain of military spending. The Empire could not afford to continue fighting, but did not know how to negotiate peace without losing face. Both military leaders admitted that they needed neutral mediators who understood their cultures well enough to find acceptable compromises, but every species that volunteered to help mediate was rejected by one side or the other as being biased or incompetent, the council tried appointing a joint mediation team with representatives from 5 different species, but the mediators spent more time arguing among themselves than talking to the warring parties. Each species had different ideas about how negotiations should work, and none of them understood Krell or Zephyrian cultural values well enough to find solutions. After 2 weeks of failed mediation attempts, the joint team gave up and recommended that the council should ask humans to return as neutral arbitrators. This suggestion created an uproar in the chamber, as delegates who had spent years criticizing human involvement were forced to admit they needed human help. Some delegates argued that asking humans to return would be admitting failure and losing face. Delegate Vexer insisted that advanced species should be able to solve their own problems without primitive human assistance, but his argument lost force when reports arrived that Vorthic colonies were rioting due to food shortages. Other delegates worried that humans would demand too high a price for their return. They feared that Earth would use the galaxy desperation to gain political advantages or special privileges. But these concerns seemed petty compared to the millions of lives being lost. In ongoing conflicts, the debate continued for days while the crises worsened. Every hour of delay meant more deaths, more economic damage, and more refugees fleeing their homes. Finally, even the most stubborn delegates realized that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Thexmar made the decision that he had hoped never to face. He authorized a direct communication to Earth government, requesting human assistance in resolving the galactic crises. The message would be broadcast on all frequencies and transmitted to every human colony in known space. Preparing the message was the most humiliating task of Thexmar's long political career. He who had publicly declared humans unfit for civilized society now had to beg them to save the galaxy from its own mistakes. The broadcast began with formal diplomatic language acknowledging the serious nature of galactic crises and expressing regret for past misunderstandings. But as Thexmar continued speaking, his desperation became obvious. He admitted that the Galactic Council had made mistakes in its treatment of humanity. He acknowledged that human contributions to galactic civilization had been undervalued and underappreciated. He offered unprecedented concessions, including permanent seats for humans on the Council ruling body, complete control over trade regulation systems, and formal recognition as the galaxy premier diplomatic species. But the most telling part of the message was when Thexmar abandoned diplomatic protocol entirely and spoke directly from his heart. He described the suffering that was spreading across the galaxy as wars raged, unchecked economies collapsed, and diseases spread untreated. He talked about the millions of refugees, including children, who were dying in overcrowded camps, the billions of civilians facing starvation as supply systems failed, the countless families torn apart by conflicts that no one knew how to resolve. Thexmar pleaded with humanity to look beyond past insults and consider the innocent lives that were being lost. He admitted that the galaxy had been wrong to reject human participation and begged Earth to give civilization another chance. The message ended with something that had never been broadcast in galactic history before: a formal apology from the Galactic Council to the human species, admitting that the Council had been prejudiced, unfair, and ultimately wrong in its treatment of Earth. When the transmission ended, Thexmar sat in his office, waiting for a response that might never come. He had humbled himself and his government before the entire galaxy. But there was no guarantee that humans would care enough to help species that had rejected. Foreign Minister Song Haijin sat in her office in Seoul, looking at the desperate message from Prime Director Thexmar that had been playing on every news channel across Earth for the past week. The same alien leader who had publicly mocked human intelligence 6 months ago was now begging humanity to save galactic civilization from complete collapse. Song Haijin was the granddaughter of one of Earth's first interstellar diplomats. She had grown up hearing stories about the early days when humans were excited to join the galactic community and eager to prove they belonged among the stars. Her grandmother had believed that patience and hard work would eventually earn respect for humanity, but Song Haijin had watched 50 years of human service to the galaxy being repaid with constant criticism and condescension. She had seen human peacekeepers die protecting alien civilians who called them primitive barbarians. She had watched human diplomats work tirelessly to prevent wars between species that considered humans too stupid to understand real politics. The decision about how to respond to the galactic crisis had been debated in Earth government for days. Some officials argued that humanity had a moral obligation to help regardless of past treatment. They pointed to the millions of innocent aliens dying in wars and famines that could be prevented with human intervention. Other officials insisted that Earth should demand major concessions before providing any assistance. They wanted guaranteed representation in galactic government control over key institutions and formal recognition of human contributions to civilization. But Song Haijin had a different perspective. She believed that this crisis was an opportunity to fundamentally change how humans related to the rest of the galaxy. Instead of returning to the old system, where humans did most of the work while aliens took most of the credit, Earth could establish new relationships based on genuine equality and mutual respect. The response that Song Haijin crafted was broadcast across the galaxy on the same frequencies that had carried GalaXY's desperate plea. Her message was clear, direct, and uncompromising. Song Haijin began by acknowledging the suffering that was spreading across galactic civilization. She expressed genuine sympathy for the innocent people caught up in wars and disasters that were beyond their control, but she also made it clear that humanity was not responsible for fixing problems that other species had created. She reminded the galaxy that humans had offered friendship, cooperation, and partnership for 50 years. The response had been constant insults, exclusion from important decisions, and public mockery of human contributions. Earth had tried to work within the existing system and had been repeatedly told that human input was unwanted and unnecessary. Song Haijin explained that the current crisis was not a natural disaster or an unavoidable tragedy. It was the direct result of decisions made by galactic leaders who had chosen to reject human participation in their civilization. The galaxy had made its choice and now had to live with the consequences. But the most important part of Song Haijin's message was her announcement of Earth's new policy toward galactic relations. Humanity would no longer participate in the Galactic Council or any other institution that treated humans as inferior partners. Instead, Earth would establish direct, bilateral relationships with individual species that demonstrated genuine respect and equality. Any alien government that wanted to work with humanity would have to apply through proper diplomatic channels. The application process would require extensive cultural education about human values and formal acknowledgement of human contributions to galactic civilization. Applicants would also need to demonstrate that they understood why previous galactic policies toward humanity had been wrong. Song Haijin made it clear that Earth was not interested in ruling the galaxy or imposing human values on other species. Humanity simply wanted to be treated as equals and to work with partners who valued human expertise and friendship. The reaction to Song Haijin's message was immediate and dramatic. Some alien leaders were outraged that humans would dare to impose conditions on providing assistance. They argued that the crisis was too serious for diplomatic games and that humans should help regardless of political considerations. But other species began to realize that the human position was entirely reasonable. Earth was offering partnership and cooperation to anyone willing to treat humans with basic respect. The only requirement was acknowledging that humans deserved equal treatment in any relationship. The first formal application for bilateral relations came from the Thorian Merchant Federation. Within days of Song Haijin broadcast, the Thorians had always been practical people who cared more about results than politics. Their economy was collapsing without human trade networks, and they needed help desperately. The Thorian application included a detailed analysis of how their government had failed to appreciate human contributions to galactic commerce. It acknowledged that Thorian merchants had become wealthy through human logistics networks without ever thanking or properly compensating the humans who made their success possible. More importantly, the Thorian application proposed a genuine partnership where humans and Thorians would work together as equals to rebuild interstellar trade. Both species would contribute their expertise and both would benefit from the results. Within weeks, the first human trade advisors arrived in Thorian space and began working with local officials to restore shipping networks. The results were dramatic. Trade routes that had been closed for months reopened, currency exchange systems began functioning, Again, cargo ships that had been stranded in port resumed their journeys. Other species watched the Thorian recovery with growing interest. The worlds that had formal relations with humanity were clearly doing better than those that remained isolated. Several alien governments quietly began preparing their own applications for bilateral relations. The Zelani Republic was the next major species to formally apologize to humanity. Their application was particularly moving because it came with personal messages from thousands of Zelani civilians whose lives had been saved by human medical researchers. The Zelani acknowledged that their artistic culture had led them to dismiss human achievements as crude and unrefined. They admitted that human medical expertise had been essential to Zelani health and that human peacekeepers had protected Zelani colonies from raiders and invaders. When human doctors returned to Zelani space, they brought new treatments for the crystal rot disease that had been killing thousands. The epidemic was brought under control within months, and grateful Zelani families began learning about human culture as a way of expressing their appreciation. The Krell Empire took longer to overcome their pride, but eventually even the warriors realized that honor meant acknowledging debts and keeping commitments. Their application focused on how human mediators had helped the Krell maintain their warrior traditions while avoiding unnecessary conflicts. The return of human peacekeepers to Krell space quickly led to ceasefire negotiations with the Zephyrian Commonwealth. Former mediator Park Min-ho came out of retirement to help end the war that had claimed millions of lives. Both sides were exhausted and eager for peace but needed cultural translation to find acceptable compromises. The Zephyrian Commonwealth submitted their own application. Emphasizing their commitment to democratic values and equal representation, they proposed a new model for human-Zephyrian cooperation, where both species would contribute to peacekeeping operations across the galaxy. Not every species was willing to meet human requirements for bilateral relations. The Vorthek Empire initially refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing in their treatment of humanity. They insisted that advanced species should not have to apologize to primitives regardless of circumstances, but as other worlds recovered through partnership with humanity, the Vorthek position became increasingly isolated. Their economy continued to collapse while their neighbors prospered. Food riots erupted in Vorthek cities as citizens demanded that their government swallow its pride and ask for human help. Eventually, even the proud Vorthek were forced to admit that survival was more important than face-saving. Their application was grudging and minimal, but it met the basic requirements for acknowledging human equality. The most difficult case was the Galactic Council itself. Prime Director Thexmar repeatedly requested that humanity return to council membership, but Earth consistently refused. The council had become a symbol of the old system that treated humans as junior partners rather than equals. Instead, Earth proposed a new form of galactic organization based on voluntary cooperation between equal partners. The new system would have no central authority that could impose decisions on member species. Instead, it would provide forums for discussion and coordination between governments that chose to participate. Some species objected that this new system would be less efficient than the old council, but efficiency had never been the real problem. The council had been effective at making decisions but terrible at implementing them because it had excluded the humans who actually did most of the work. The new galactic order that emerged was fundamentally different from what had existed before. Instead of a hierarchical system with advanced species governing primitive ones, there was a network of partnerships between equals. Each relationship was based on mutual benefit and genuine respect. Ambassador Kim Day was appointed as Earth First Minister of Bilateral Relations. He spent his days